Hi, I'm Mimi Zeiger. I'm a faculty member here at SCI-Arc. I'm a visiting professor. I'm also a critic and curator. I'm excited to have Tanner Blackman here with me today in conversation to talk about some of the sort of questions around homelessness, the causes, maybe some of the policy that leads into questions of Skid Row. Tanner is a partner at Kendall Kagan Public Affairs Advocacy, where he works with real estate development and public policy clients. He's an adjunct professor of urban planning at USC Price School of Public Policy. He's taught at SCI-Arc as well. And from 2012 to 2015, Tanner was the planning director for Councilmember Jose Huizar's of the LA Council District 14, and he was overseeing development in downtown Los Angeles. And among his many accomplishments, he was a planner for the Code Studies section of the City of LA's Department of City Planning and served as an elected director of the Downtown Los Angeles Neighborhood Council. So thank you for joining us, Tanner.
Thank you for having me. Sorry for making you spit out all of that intro there.
So many words, but this brings all the expertise that we need to start this conversation. Tanner, you've worked on policy and development in downtown for many years. And what would be great is to give us a quick history of Skid Row. How would you define it, and how did it develop?
Great. I'll do my best. First off, I want to just thank you for inviting me out to this. I have a lot of experience with SCI-Arc. I live in the neighborhood, so I'm a fan, supporter, neighbor of the school, and always honored to come out and help and share my opinion here. As you listed off, I have various experience working on policy and development in downtown from various positions in various parts of the table. So, on the community side with the neighborhood council, on the sort of actually overseeing the district with the council member, and the sort of long-range policy with the planning department, and now working on a number of new real estate developments that are, changing downtown skylines and its streetscapes, and it's adding new housing and jobs and stuff to the area. So I have different perspectives from which I can share. It's interesting. I also, like I said, I'm a neighbor. I live right now at 6th and Mateo, and my office is at 6th and Hope. Previously, I lived at 6th and Los Angeles, and so the sort of 6th Street, the 6th Street corridor is sort of near and dear to my heart. My commute, whether it's bike, Uber, or driving, I end up going 5th Street one way and 6th Street back home the other way, and I'm always sort of going through the heart of Skid Row, where I think a lot of Angelinos sort of astutely avoid at times. And it's funny because whenever I'm riding an Uber through, I feel like every third Uber driver I am ever riding with, it's their first time going through Skid Row, and I end up doing this sort of like history lesson about, there was an active policy of containment. But the history of how sort of Skid Row became Skid Row goes back to really sort of like late 19th century development around, this area. This building itself was, like the Santa Fe Rail Depot, and was important with a lot of the sort of goods infrastructure and movement through the area. In the adjacency to the LA River, and the rail lines are part of what grew up a lot of this sort of warehousing, goods movement, storing around the area, which provided a lot of sort of seasonal short-term jobs for a lot of sort of itinerant working poor workers. And that's when a lot of, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a number of these what have come to be called single room occupancy or apartment hotels were created that were, just the most efficient of efficiency units that folks could stay in for a short period while they were working here. Over the years, the city sort of, when the CRAs were developed, the community redevelopment agencies had kind of targeted this area then since there was already this infrastructure of apartment hotels and sort of, low rent sort of flop houses, to allow service providers to then start setting up in the area as well, and this almost sort of active policy of containment while the CRA was focusing on sort of urban renewal and redeveloping other parts of downtown. And so that's when a lot of the midnight missions and other sort of service providers really sort of providing services and setting up in a big way here. And then that sort of followed more of the nonprofit affordable housing developers and who were rehabbing some of the buildings and nowadays building ground up construction.
Can we talk a little bit about this relationship between laborers and the single occupancy hotel, like the way that, or single room occupancy, the way that maybe it would be one person who needed one type of space, and how that both set a precedent for a kind of architecture, but also how it is no longer maybe what is needed?
The one thing I'd like to note, just as being, moving about this city and stuff, it's sort of interesting to see where even the sign on this building, the old historic sign, the roof sign faces the river. And then if you start, head into downtown proper to the historic core, take a look and you'll notice the Roslyn Loft sign also points towards the river, instead of where a lot of the core of downtown nowadays and everything is more westerly side of it. And so that's a remnant of how the river and these rail connections were this sort of vital attractor and what we're bringing people to this area. And so these SRO units, since they were created as just apartment hotels for short-term workers, they did not have things like kitchens in the units. They did not typically have bathrooms at all. They were, shared facilities. So you were basically renting just a room, and then the bathrooms down at the end of the hall. If you're lucky, maybe you get a hot plate or something. So the early movement in some of the nonprofits that there's actually a nonprofit called SRO Housing. There's the Skid Row Housing Trust. They were as the service provider set up and different things changed with, drugs and mental illness and different things sort of over time that contributed to why the sort of population of homelessness were increasing. Since there was this stock of these sort of housing already around that was, affordable, that folks started to rehab these units. And so some of the early, nonprofit projects in the Skid Row are just these sort of unamenitized single room units. And even the developers themselves, these nonprofit developers who first were rehabbing these, have sort of moved on from that product type where, people need to have a workable kitchen or at least kitchenette in their space. They often need to have their own wash facilities, their own, a restroom in their units. And so as you've seen this sort of funding channels through, tax credits and other subsidies that create affordable housing, what we're seeing now is a lot more sort of ground up new construction of full units that have kitchens, bathrooms, and then either also, services on the ground floor and shared spaces for the residents and things that help with sort of rehabilitation in the kind of crisis community that Skid Row has become.
And the CRA, now the demolition of SROs happened in San Francisco. It was always targeted as slums. This is something we wanted to fix up. But in Los Angeles, it was contained. And can we talk a little bit about the difference in policy between the containment of Skid Row and then, say, the dispersal of homeless populations across LA?
Yeah. I think also Bunker Hill is interesting because by, Bunker Hill, which was once these sort of Victorian mansions, by the mid-20th century had become the sort of object number one of the sort of CRA's argument for blight, and sort of apparently a lot of these mansions had become just crammed full of people in very slummy living conditions themselves. And so when, I think that there was some initial population shift to when the sort of actual urban renewal slum clearance began in earnest in Bunker Hill, that a lot of more folks sort of made their way over down to Skid Row, where and I was looking at the history of it, and there was later on a sort of project area made for industrial district in this side of downtown, but a lot of those focuses and where I think we really see the historic impact in the skyline of the CRA is on all of those towers in Bunker Hill and stuff that would not have been there but for public intervention. But in those project areas, what they often did over the years too, and were able to do, is direct some of these sort of residual public benefits or funding to the service providers in the area, and to sort of help maintain some of this pipeline of service provision, but by sort of creating a place where it's allowed under this sort of rubric of containment, of trying to keep it there, it really created an infrastructure of service provision that you really couldn't duplicate anywhere else. And it was the CRA and the mayor, sort of complicit on this. And it's sort of, for better or worse, it's, the situation we have now, where we have, the Midnight Mission, we have all of these, the Weingart Center, we have all of these sort of things co-housed in one spot.
Yeah, as things have gotten more dispersed and solutions try to come up, a lot of the fear or NIMBYism around adding services to a neighborhood that maybe has had a rise in homeless populations comes from that sort of image of Skid Row as a place of containment, and no one else wants that to be their neighborhood.
Yeah.
But I'm really intrigued by talking about some of these services, and tell me a little bit more about sort of what you see as these sort of minimum needs that these services offer.
Well, I want to dig down a little bit on this sort of containment versus decentralization sort of thing, because I think that's important to understand how the dynamic has sort of changed a little bit and how the folks are discussing it, where I first moved to downtown in 2009, and there was this sort of populating of the historic core going on through the adaptive reuse ordinance projects and everything. And downtown was this really interesting sort of, unique test trial sort of place where you had expensive new condos right next to these 100% affordable projects. I still think at 5th and Spring, the Starbucks at the ground floor of that building is one of the only Starbuckses in the States that's actually in a 100% affordable housing building. And the way that this sort of, multi-economic point sort of community seemed to be sort of working in this early parts of downtown sort of growth. And then it sort of seemed, I don't know why, something sort of switched when the situation seemed to be getting worse a little bit. And as just more and more residents were downtown, and some of them little clusters of condo ownership in different areas where people have different views, of long-term views towards the communities that they're living in, you saw a little bit of a pushback more from this new resident population and the new business community to sort of try to not allow more new housing for this population, and to try to literally decentralize and therefore to actively disperse some of that infrastructure of service provision that was created there. And I was very involved in a lot of these conversations, first in the neighborhood council, then working for the council member. And I understand this sort of desire of why the homelessness is a regional problem, and that different communities everywhere ought to, take on their fair share. But just from the sort of idea of thinking about things from land use and such, trying to site any of these facilities, you're not going to recreate a Midnight Mission in Sherman Oaks or whatnot. We're having a whole lot of trouble in the city, even citing some of the bridge housing projects right now that the mayor's been undertaking that, I think we've only really found locations for a few of those at the moment. So just there's a sort of arc from kind of, these sort of civic drives from containment to kind of decentralization and dispersion. And I think some of that's coming from the downtown, sort of this growing downtown community that didn't really exist in the ways that it did 10, 15 years ago. In terms of minimums, it's interesting because there's both the sort of public realm and public sector aspects of these discussions, and then a little bit what we touched on earlier on what does one need for a minimum requirement for their home and to live a life. And then how do you couple that with actual services in the buildings so that people have an opportunity for rehabilitation and whatnot? Because one of the arguments, I think, against new housing of this certain type for these certain communities in Skid Row is that, and I've heard this articulated, where people say, like the service providers and nonprofits, they'll say, well, we're going to build 100 new units here. We're taking 100 people off the street, putting them in housing, giving them services, getting them on the right path. And then a sort of response to that will be folks saying, no, you're not. Those people aren't going to qualify for your units. You're just going to bring in other people and compound this sort of problem where you're putting more people in recovery in an environment where there's rampant drugs and sort of different things, and that, you know, this whole problem of some folks being sort of unhousable and such. And so there's this dynamic that, yes, I agree, you know, more areas of the region need to take on more fair share, but I don't think that there's any way that we're gonna like dismantle Skid Row in the future. And some of these sort of, you know, spatiality, what is Skid Row, where do the lines, where are the other communities? It's interesting because I think some of the more sort of development positive thinkers out there will make this argument that, you know, by new development happening, there means there'll be more investment in and around the fringes of Skid Row. And one thing Skid Row needs is to become more regularized as a place in Los Angeles and have things that other places take for granted, like normal working streets and bike lanes and street trees and benches and other things like that. And that by, you know, new restaurants and bars or different things on the fringe there, you'll get more eyes on the street, more activation, and that sort of hard line of division will start to blend in, and you'll see just sort of, you know, like development raising all ships or something. So that's one, you know, very like pro-development, development positive way of looking at some of these spatiality things.
But does that just, in the same way that bringing in 100 new people into new housing, would this sort of street trees and benches only sort of disperse people more, displace the people who were on 6th and 7th and now are going to have to find other encampment areas to go to?
Exactly. I mean, that's the exact flip side of that coin, where I specifically recently was working on a development proposal, a project that got approved by the city of Los Angeles mid last year, for a 33-story tower at 7th and Maple, so just east of Los Angeles Street. There's the Santee Courts building there, if you know, and Santee Courts is lovely. It's this adaptive reuse building, and it has this sort of interior courtyard that's lined with some shops and different stuff. And our project was bringing some of its open space down to the ground plane instead of keeping it all captive on our parking decks or different stuff, and creating this sort of, you know, third of, or half an acre at least, sort of paseo around the project that connects into Santee Court. And we were all proud of that sort of public realm feature. Look, we're gonna make this open to everybody. And then because the land as it was zoned industrial, the city planning department in recent years, as they've been sort of looking at allowing hybrid industrial and different mixed uses in some of these industrial areas, we're basically requesting that those projects contribute affordable housing. So we were having this 33-story tower. We had like 452 units. So 11% of our units were targeted for very low-income housing. And we thought that was a great selling point as well. Look, we're providing affordable housing opportunities. And we started to get a little bit of protest from some of the organized Skid Row groups. There's the Los Angeles Community Action Network. There's you know, a few other groups that sort of organize and help provide other homeless services, but sort of we try to be a voice for the Skid Row community. And they weren't happy with our project at first. And I think I had tended to think of some of these issues somewhat simply at times, where you know, there's more of a movement of cities to sort of require affordable housing in all new development. I think already in, you know, Santa Monica and different places, 20% across the board or things like that. I had always been a big fan of those types of things, and so it was sort of a selling point to this project. You know, we have this public realm thing, we have other stuff that we're bringing 11% affordable, and in dealing with LA Can and the Skid Row community, that wasn't doing anything for them. And what it is it ties to sort of what affordability means and these different affordability levels. So according to the, you know, Housing and Urban Development, the HUD, the federal agency, if you pay more than 30% of your income to cover the cost of your housing, then your housing is not affordable. So if it's less than that threshold, then it's
So that's all our houses.
it's
right?
basically, yeah. And then that's broken up by sort of area median income, which is not as, it's by census tract, so it's not as, neighborhood by neighborhood. And then every year, based on the sort of what the area median income is, the city's housing agencies set what affordability means at these different levels for projects that are covenanted to target, to offer, housing at these different affordability levels. So very low income means that folks living there should make no more than half of the area median income. So area median income these days in our areas is 59,000 around there. So half of that is folks who are making $28,000 a year or so. And so the reason for the opposition of the Skid Row community at us wanting to offer these affordable units is that the people that they advocate for make nothing or make next to nothing and need, what's called extremely low income housing, which targets less than 30% of AMI, or permanent supportive housing is what people call the sort of concept of those in housing for those at the most dire need. Yeah. And then there's other levels of low income is up to 80% of AMI, and then these other sort of less defined terms that look different municipalities define on their own, but these ideas of sort of moderate income or workforce housing, which can be in that 80 to 120 or even 150, depending who you ask. And that's what people talk about, the sort of housing for teachers or nurses or, people who that sort of have normal jobs or something. And so in dealing with sort of some of the opposition of this group, not only was it the housing that they were targeting as not working for the Skid Row community, but also the fact that just by us building an otherwise luxury tower on the corner of area that they consider within the core of Skid Row, that even if we have this nice sort of open area on our outside, that it's not going to be accessible to them, to this community. That means we're going to have it be a securitized space, and we're going to chase off folks with our security guards or whatnot, and therefore it just sort of it's removed from the map of the place that sort of they consider part of Skid Row, and that there was all these other affordable housings right around us where people need to walk down the street and go to service provision over here or to see a doctor over here or something. And so one thing that they were really concerned about is sort of these pathways of travel and making sure that everybody will be welcome in our paseo, and that we won't be running everybody off as soon as anybody sort of lingers in there. And so it was interesting. We ended up changing the formula of the affordability a little bit, and then also addressing some of the community concerns by offering to fund some other infrastructural things around. So the project kind of like ponied up some funds for some other projects that were really important to the community, like improving the bathrooms at the two parks in Skid Row. There's San Julian Park and Gladys Park. Chrysalis, this excellent nonprofit that their offices are on Main Street right near the Nickel Diner, and they do this sort of retraining for Skid Row population and then kind of like offer temp services and other little kind of jobs. So if you're ever having like an event or something, use Chrysalis to do your cleanup or different things. They're a great nonprofit. And they're building out on a piece of property that they own in Skid Row this thing called bin space.
I've heard about bin space recently.
Yeah,
it's in the paper.
Which is basically a big building full of lockers and storage rooms and spaces that for folks to have a place to put their possessions during the day, and also then some sort of wash facilities or shower facilities as well. And then although it was short-lived, the mayor was also doing this sort of refresh spot, which was sort of showers and storage as well. And there's this movement to kind of provide storage space for the homeless is a way to kind of, I guess, not have constant encampments. But we hadn't really even touched on the Jones settlement and all of that right now.
I want to follow up on some of the things that you brought up here before we sort of get into some of the questions about stuff and the criminalization of homelessness. Because I think you're touching on something where there's a changing typology of what you need for housing. Like, this isn't just a sort of a single thing, that we're looking at housing that may include luxury housing, affordable housing, and then make provisions for very low income or even sort of for services. And I think that's something that maybe when we talk about housing, we call it, mixed use, or having a couple of cafes on the ground floor. Like, we are not talking about it architecturally as sort of providing different ways in for these income questions. And I was wondering if you could parse some of that. Is like, from your working with developers, do you see that someone might embrace the idea of a sort of multi-economic housing?
It's interesting. I don't have the answers. I hope students at this school help forge some of these answers in the future, but I see some of the challenges where we already mentioned this idea of inclusionary zoning, and cities more and more moving to this requirement of having affordable units in any and all new development. In some ways, it's just in certain specific plans. In some cities, it's the entire city. And I think that we're going to be seeing this more and more as part of this sort of value capture idea of how can, we make developers both do well and do good or something, right? And a lot of my clients nowadays are, real estate developers who have very bottom line considerations and trying to get their projects financed and what they think the project can carry and all of these type things. And so there's this tendency where to try to find ways around these requirements, right? Yeah. Where folks, they see it and they're like, okay, well, can we offsite those requirements? Like, can I buy the building next door too and turn that into affordable housing, basically, because I don't want to put it in my luxury high-rise, steel and glass tower. Like, the folks will make this argument that it doesn't even make sense to put these affordable units in these sort of high-rise buildings with their cost of construction and those sort of things. I mean, I'm not here to argue what's right or wrong in that, but just identifying that there's this tendency for folks to want to try to, like, on the development side, to either push that off-site, or because I think that they struggle to find ways to integrate all the sort of areas and services and open space and these sort of different things within buildings. And I think that's more and more the challenge, where whether or not there's like anything ever takes off with sort of buzzwords like co-living or things like that, what we definitely see is this impetus for developers to want to do ever smaller micro loft type units, and partly to squeeze a more per units per square foot sort of yield off any given piece of property, but also that they're being sort of cheered on to do so a little bit by policymakers and planners nowadays, to think that, oh, we have such a housing crisis, micro living is cool. And then at the same time, in some of these new codes and different things, you have like ever greater kind of on-site open space requirements as well. So as you extrude that from the ground plane, you end up with these really tiny units and then big amenitized shared spaces in some of these newer buildings around downtown that, almost this sort of like, cruise ship sort of atmosphere of there's your pool and your rec room and your whatnot. And so early projects, before there were actually rules about that, there was some famous examples in New York and other places where they were actually trying to separate the amenities and the entrances and this concept of the pour door. Yeah. And so I'm not entirely sure on the legality widespread of that, but I know a lot of municipalities have made sort of specific rules saying you cannot have a pour door, you have to provide, these units have to be basically of the same type and variety and have same access to the amenities in a building as anybody else. And so, and especially as I'm making the point of how sort of a big bulk of these buildings now is often in these sort of shared spaces and smaller little, living spaces. So I don't know what that answer is, but I sort of, that's I think a challenge to sort of, if we're going towards a future where we can expect like 15, 20% of every building, to have to carry an affordable component, then we just are going to have people of different economic spaces living in sharing the same space, the same driveway, the same everything. And that's an interesting challenge, I think, for designers in the future.
Which also sort of puts us back to sort of the question of cities, right? Like that is, the notion of cities is that economically we are commingled in many ways. It's almost sort of reversing some of the sort of removal from the flight from the city from before in sort of putting everybody back together.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk, as we finish up here, about this idea of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the criminalization
Mm-hmm.
of homelessness around the stuff, and maybe how BIN might answer some of these questions.
It's funny, I think that kind of segues really well from the discussion of how you do that within a given building,
Right.
but that how we do that as we're sharing our city streets, okay, because BIN, I like these projects, I like, but I also think that there's something strange there that we always have to take a second to kind of recognize, that by the need that BIN is addressing is sort of assumes that, as a society, we're already accepting that people are just gonna live outdoors. Right? And that they are gonna wake up on the street, and in order for a business to open up behind that or something, they're gonna need to put their stuff somewhere. So I think there's something hard to swallow about just the sort of tacit acceptance of that when you're thinking about sort of the need for these types of spaces. But touching back on, so there's an important thing, a 2006 settlement in the city of Los Angeles called the Jones Settlement, where the city used to have specific rules on the books that allowed LAPD and street services and other folks to actually take encampments and take people's stuff and in order, health and safety, to kind of clear out encampments. And in other parts of the city, they could just clean up these encampments. In Skid Row, there was this sort of not exactly codified sort of understanding that in a sense, the police would tell people to get their stuff off the street by a certain time. And if they didn't, then they would take it to one of a few storage facilities in the industrial district, and essentially folks could come and pick up their stuff later. But, sometimes stuff was thrown away or burned or different things, and if someone's living on the streets, then very likely their ID is in that encampment, their medicines, their whatnot, and so that this was, impacting people's sort of ability to live on the street. And the ACLU actually, on behalf of folks, sued the city, and they reached the settlement, and that meant that the city, for a number of years, could not enforce any of these rules about removing people's property from the streets. The settlement was in 2006. 2 years later was the Great Recession, mm-hmm. and we saw this sort of then just growth of encampments that then, instead of moving every day, had become permanent in these areas and grew to be in neighborhoods around the city where they had never been mm-hmm. before. And it's weird. I think that part of that sort of just the visibility of these encampments growing to different area is what led to us, frankly, having a policy response now, where we've adopted Measure H and Measure HHH, and are for the first time in recent decades actually putting money towards the problem of homelessness and trying to address it in any real way. I still think it's kind of a drop in the bucket, or I don't know, I'm not too hopeful for that we're solving Skid Row immediately, but I do think that it's great that there is some positive movement in that direction. And but there's the issues about stuff are still ongoing. Yeah. That they're
even bridge housing doesn't seem to have enough room for stuff.
That in particular, and then even just in October of 2018, there was some protests at City Hall and some other complaints that in some of the recent cleanups in response to tuberculosis or things like that in Skid Row, that the city was still taking people's stuff in ways that they shouldn't be. And so this is still an ongoing issue for Skid Row.
Yep. As we wrap up, is there we've talked about so many different points around these questions of homelessness, of affordability, of Skid Row sort of boundaries. Is there any one point you'd like the students today to take away and maybe focus on that you feel like where there is possible movement?
There is possible movement. I think so back to the H and HHH, we're literally going to have hundreds of millions of dollars a year pouring into the issue, and billions over time. And I do think that the potential for that is great. I'm a little bit worried on sort of like the oversight thereof, and the fact that in our political culture nowadays with term limits and everything, a lot of politicians are just sort of looking for the next job. So I think folks can kind of easily congratulate themselves, yay, we got HHH adopted, and then run on that for their next job. But it's up to sort of, everyone to make sure that there's sort of long-term accountability, that we're not just pissing away some of this money after, programs that haven't been successful over the years, and that we actually get the housing we need.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanner.
Thank you so much.
We're excited to see what comes out of the Charrette today, and hopefully you'll be able to come take a look.
Thank you so much, Mimi.
Thank you.